Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Dungeon Siege is one of those RPG series that I somehow missed for all these years. I always wanted to start with the first game and play all of them in a chronological order so I can get a full picture about these well-beloved games. So I finally did it, and we're going to talk about all of these games and my personal experience after playing all of them.
Suspicion is an ugly trait in a man, dearest.
The first two games are critically acclaimed by fans and the critics, so I was really excited to finally try them out. Although not all of these games have been met with such a warm reception from RPG lovers. Unfortunately, this series ended with a game that many fans of the series hated, and for a good reason.
Would you judge me so quickly on account of my blood?
Dungeon Siege 3 is the only game from the trilogy that I played and covered before. I also played Throne of Agony on PSP, and we're going to talk about that game as well, even though it has nothing to do with the trilogy. I'll also have GOG links for Dungeon Siege collection, so if you decide you wanna check out these games on GOG, you will support the channel by using that link. Huge thanks to all of the channel members and Patreons, and if you wanna find out different ways to support the channel, stick around until the end of the video. The first Dungeon Siege game came out in 2002 for PC, and it had a great reception. It's a pretty old game, but it runs very good on modern systems, at least it did for me. I'm not sure if there's a proper way to run it in Full HD or higher resolutions though. After doing some digging, I settled with a recommended resolution, which would be 1680 by 1050. Everything higher than that would just make the UI extremely small and hard to see. I also had some crashes here and there, but it wasn't a huge deal. I just saved very often, like I do in pretty much all RPGs. Putting that aside, you start the game by making a character with some very basic customization options. You get introduced to the story and the setting with a simple fly-through cutscene where you learn about the brief history of this world. Long time ago, the Empire of Stars was destroyed by its legion and evil forces, but the most loyal people from the legion withdrew to the west and created a new kingdom. The Kingdom of Ebb was at peace for 300 years, but that's going to change as soon as you start the game. Yeah, very convenient. The main character is just a farmer with no real background, and your first quest is to get to the city of Stonebridge and fight the garrison leader, Gjorm. The story remains very simple and straightforward throughout the whole game, and I like it for what it is. But the story rarely gets in the way of the gameplay, which is what you'll be doing for 90% of the time. The sequels will add more story elements like party banter, cutscenes and so on, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The gameplay in Dungeon Siege is a lot more engaging than I initially expected. You start off by controlling a single character that you made, and the game tries its best to teach you the basic mechanics. Attacking is done simply by clicking on the enemy, and you control the camera by holding the scroll button. You get a melee weapon and a couple of spells, and this is where the game teaches you the most important thing about the gameplay. Well, one of the most important things at least, which will be how the progression system works. To put it simply, Dungeon Siege has improved on use system. So for example, if you use melee weapons a lot, your melee skill and strength stats will eventually improve, which allows you to equip stronger weapons and armor. I love how the game gives you all options from the very beginning, and it's up to you how you're going to build your character. There are 4 slots which are used for melee, ranged, and a couple of spells that you can cast. You can find or buy a bunch of spells from different schools of magic. Switching between these 4 slots is done by clicking on them or by using a proper keybind. That's pretty much all gameplay systems in Dungeon Siege, believe it or not. Now, you might think that's very simple because it is, but Dungeon Siege has a very enjoyable and challenging tactical gameplay. You start realizing this soon enough after you get at least a couple of more characters in your party. The max party size is 8, and you gradually meet new characters that you can recruit for gold, usually in towns or at the end of some main quests. The donkey or the pack mule is kinda annoying, but the poor thing tries to keep out of combat and he can carry a lot of stuff for you. I just gave up on the stupid thing in later chapters because he would just randomly stay back. Like way back. Now of course, all of these characters in the party have the same rules set for the combat, and you get to manage their behavior and issue different commands. Managing your party in combat is very important. The gameplay is real-time with pause, which should be familiar to most people who played similar CRPGs. Although labeling Dungeon Siege as a CRPG might be a bit of a stretch because of the streamlined progression system and a couple of other reasons, but that's not that important. You can issue different commands when you pause the game or in the middle of action, and the AI is quick to respond, for the most time. As for the strategy elements, you get several different options for positioning your party and the follow feature, which can be very annoying sometimes. For example, if you turn it off, you constantly need to pay attention to the positioning of all of your characters. That's usually what I prefer, and come to think of it, it's kinda mandatory in this game. But your characters can straight up refuse your commands sometimes. The way you position your characters in combat is one of the key factors for defeating enemies. For example, if you put your mages in the front line, they will get targeted by the nearest enemy, and I found it really hard to get the aggro back to my melee characters. There are some spells that you can use to mitigate this, but I try to keep it very simple when it comes to my mages. I mostly focus on getting them to use healing spells and keep my melee characters alive, with occasionally using damage dealing spells if possible. The tactical features in this game are serviceable, but certainly a bit janky every now and then. Like I said, I turned off the follow feature and I used Ctrl A for selecting the whole party. I would manually select my melee characters and push them in the front line to get the attention of enemies, while keeping the ranged and mage characters behind. However, there were a lot of situations where my mages just stayed back for no reason, even though I selected the whole party. I thought I was doing something wrong in those situations, but nope, it was just the AI refusing to listen to commands sometimes. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but you can easily get your whole party killed in this game because of a single mistake, even on normal difficulty. To make things even more frustrating, if your characters actually get killed, they drop all of their items from the inventory. When you resurrect them, you'll need to manually pick up all of the items and equip them all over again. I would rather load the previous save than to do this, which goes to show you how annoying this feature can be. That being said, I love the challenge in this game, and now I wish to start a fresh playthrough on the hardest difficulty because I understand how the mechanics work. The game also has some preset AI behaviors that you can select for all individual party members, and I tried every possible option, but that didn't solve those annoying AI issues. Putting that aside, all of these features are simple to understand, and you really don't need to micromanage your party. I'm not sure about the hard difficulty, so don't take my word for it. Now, if those gameplay systems sound too complicated, that means I'm doing a poor job of explaining things. There are no unique skill trees or anything similar to that, and the whole progression system is automatized and simplified. You only get to affect it by choosing what weapon or spell you use in combat. You could even say that this is a very streamlined RPG progression system, but not in a bad way. You only get to focus on your party behavior, gear, and positioning in combat, and it's very fun to try and master this gameplay loop. There's a lot of items to pick up, and it works really similar to most RPGs. These items have stats requirements and a couple of different quality levels. The economy in this game seems pretty tight, even though I did pick up a lot of items, which I frequently sold in towns. And still, I could barely afford to recruit some characters in the second part of the game. The lack of teleport to town also makes getting more gold by selling things harder in general.
Good luck to you then, and try to stay warm.
That's just an observation because I'm completely fine with the economy system in this game. I love how the gameplay system works in this game and how challenging it can be. You can feel how the game becomes more challenging as you progress through the chapters. That means that you should try to improve the gear of your party members and maybe get another character to join your party. Dungeon Siege is a very linear game with only a handful of locations that you can explore off the beaten paths. However, you're going to visit a lot of great dungeons throughout the campaign, which have some secrets to find and optional fights. Even though the map is very linear, it functions like an open world game, in a way. You're just pushing forward for the most part, but there are no loading screens, which is pretty impressive. I also like how enemies can actually flank you in combat, even though it's a pretty linear map design. This always keeps you on your toes and it makes the gameplay harder, but more engaging if you ask me. It's not that difficult to control the enemy AI because you can always go back and regroup or try to pull a smaller amount of enemies on your party. By the way, your characters don't get killed instantly, they only get knocked down. They get killed only if they receive more damage while being on the ground, at least I think that's how it works. This can create some highly intensive situations, especially if you're losing a fight and your healing mage is knocked down. I would try to move the enemies away, so my mages have some breathing room when they wake up and we can start the fight again. Using health and mana potions is also a big deal in the game, and all of your characters should have them in their personal inventory. By pressing the potions button they all try to use them, but only if they have them in the inventory. I had a lot of situations where I just ran out of health or mana potions, which made the game a lot harder, but this is also my fault for not picking all of them when possible. The sequel is even more annoying when it comes to potions, but we'll get there. The boss fights didn't age all that well in this game, and there are few and far between. I think fighting regular and elite enemies throughout the game is way more interesting. This is something that the second game will drastically improve. As for the visuals, well, it's a 2002 game that didn't age all that well, to be honest. Not because of the low graphical fidelity, because that's to be expected in such an old game. But even the artistic style is a bit generic and lifeless, for the lack of a better word. On the bright side, the locations you're going to visit have a nice visual variety. I also think it's a bit annoying when you get to fight the enemies that have identical colors to the environment, which happens every now and then. It's hard to see what's going on in those situations, but here comes a very special feature in the game that we still didn't talk about. Dungeon Siege allows you to open up your map and even play the whole game in this special little gameplay mode. It can be very useful in a lot of situations, especially in the dense forest areas or when enemies are hard to see, like I mentioned before. It's much easier to see all enemies which are coming from all sides of the map and manage your party, especially because the camera in the normal mode is not the best. Overall, this is an amazing RPG. I will happily come back for another playthrough in the future. It seems like a very replayable RPG where you can try different things with your party. I highly recommend trying it out, especially if you never played it before. Dungeon Siege 2 came out in 2005 for PC, and just like the first game, the sequel received some great reviews from the critics and the fans. First of all, I had some extremely annoying issues with my save games. I lost a lot of progress on my save file, not once but twice, and that's one of the worst feelings ever. Although I can't only blame the game for this, because I forgot to save before I exit. Modern games spoiled us a lot, which I get reminded of every now and then. I'm pretty sure I would manage to finish the game by now, but even so, I played more than enough to be able to talk about it in this video. Oh, and by the way, I followed this video for making the game run smoothly on modern PCs, and I was able to run it on 4K with no UI problems, and I also didn't have any crashes. I know this game has some very good mods as well, but I always like to play the vanilla version before I even think about installing mods. Anyway, I couldn't wait to finally jump right into this game and try it out. I immediately noticed some improvements, but also some missing features from the first game. The first game felt a bit more like a CRPG, while the second is definitely more like a ARPG. Before we start talking about the gameplay though, let's mention the story first. This time around, you actually start the game as a bad guy. You and your friend Draven are serving as mercenaries in the army of Valdis, the main antagonist of the game. I really don't like the tutorial section because the game just casually breaks the fourth wall.
You lot are late! There's a few extra scraps in the barrels. Break them open by right-clicking them. Now get out of my face, maggot! To attack, right-click your enemy or target. Got it?
This would be totally fine if the whole story is done in a comedic and goofy way, but it's not. Draven notices from the beginning that something is not right with this mission, and he's right, because not long after that you get attacked by Valdis.
Look out!
Draven gets killed, but before that he was talking about some medallion, which turns out to be very important later on in the game.
Stop a moment. My medallion. I know how you feel about it, but I just can't shake this feeling that something is going to happen.
Yeah, Draven is basically Geralt from The Witcher.
I'm looking for a whore.
No, but seriously, the story is pretty simple once again, but I think it's much better compared to the first game, although that ain't saying much. Your main goal in the game is to stop Valdis from creating another cataclysm. It's worth mentioning that this game has a lot more cutscenes that play as you progress through the main story. What's even better, there is some party banter that I really liked, although it usually happens in the wrong time.
If you're ever trying to learn the truth about something, ask me. I've got a gift for starting a week.
All dialogue is voice acted in the sequel, and it's clear that this game had a much bigger budget in general. There is one plot twist which was very predictable if you pay attention. The game foreshadows the plot twist a lot in some dialogue situations, but overall I did enjoy the simple story and characters of Dungeon Siege 2. It's all about the gameplay when it comes to these games, so let's talk about that, starting with those major changes I mentioned before. Controlling your character in the sequel is similar, but certainly not the same. That means that you can't use the mouse to select all characters, or select a couple of characters from your party and issue specific commands to them. To make a long story short, the sequel is more about controlling a single character while you let the AI take care of things for your party. Doesn't sound too different compared to the first game, but trust me, it is. The gameplay is definitely more action-oriented this time around. You need to hold the right mouse button to auto-attack, and you occasionally get to use unique character powers when they're off cooldown. The sequel also has proper skill trees for melee, ranged, and different schools of magic, and you get points to invest when you level up. Dungeon Siege 2 has a more traditional leveling up system where you gain experience from killing monsters. The skill trees are pretty simple, but a welcoming addition for sure. I also love experimenting with different abilities and trying to find the perfect match for my party. Investing points into passive skill trees also unlocks those special abilities that we mentioned, which are extremely powerful. Maybe even a bit OP, because it feels like you're just trying to survive long enough until you can just blast the enemy with one of those abilities. The game has some very satisfying visual and sound effects, which gives those abilities a great sense of impact. You get 4 slots for different spells and only 1 slot for the weapon now, but you can just open the inventory and change the weapon if needed, it's not a big deal. This part of the gameplay is pretty much the same, you can switch spells or weapons in the middle of combat. Speaking of similar features, the idea for progression is also the same. The Improve on You system works great in the sequel as well, if not a bit better. What makes improving your skills a bit easier in the sequel are respawning enemies. This wasn't the case in the first game because once you kill enemies on the map, they will be gone for good. Enemies in the sequel will respawn pretty fast actually. You can teleport back to the city and get some potions, and when you get back, you'll find at least a couple of enemies that respawns. Speaking of portals, yeah, the sequel has this feature now, which makes things a lot easier in general. On the other side, here's what makes the game a lot harder in general. Well, first of all, the beginning of the game is hard as nails, it's way harder compared to the first game. Unlike the first game, you can only select one difficulty because unlocking hard difficulties is done by having higher level characters. You can easily get one-shotted by some enemies, but it's fun to try and overcome the challenge. Using similar tactics from the first game is still kinda viable, like trying to pull fewer enemies at once and spreading them out. But this won't help you a lot if your gear sucks and you have no armor, or if you lack the manpower. Dying is very common in this game, at least I hope so, because my characters die all the time. If you're a new player and you get discouraged by this, just try to be more patient, or just try to level up your other skills in previous zones, which will make your life a lot easier. I tend to stick with one tactic until I hit a brick wall, and you will hit those walls in this game, especially on the first playthrough. Things will get a lot easier when you finally get the full party, but the game still remains challenging. Dungeon Siege 2 allows you to have up to 4 characters in your party on normal, 5 members on veteran, and 6 members on elite difficulty. My main character was a two-handed DPS warrior, surprise surprise. I had one melee character who's supposed to be a tank, a healer, and a ranged character. The strategy elements in the sequel have been streamlined a little bit to properly support the new action-oriented gameplay. The combat in the first game was more static, so those strategy elements felt appropriate and pretty useful. However, the sequel only has 2 different quote-unquote strategy elements for controlling your party. The first one is called Mirror, which keeps your party members very close to the character that you're controlling, and they all attack the same targets. The second one is called Rampage, which spreads out the party members and makes them behave in a way that you previously selected. You still have the option to pause the game and issue commands to all of your party members, but I only use it for checking the health of my characters and maybe switching the weapon sometimes. For 90% of the time, these 2 options for controlling your party members work fine. Rampage can be very unpredictable sometimes, especially when it comes to positioning. I would really love to have the option to manually put my ranged characters back like in the first game, but the sequel just doesn't work like that. My biggest problem with the gameplay is dying, which is somehow even more annoying than in Dungeon Siege 1. Just like in the first game, you drop all of your items upon death, but it's not game over if all of your characters die. The game just takes some of your gold and respawns you in the city. Running back to the corpse to retrieve your items is the dumbest idea ever, and you can easily die again because you're naked. To make things even worse, sometimes the game just ignores your movement commands on certain terrain, which can get you killed. I don't like the camera in this game, and it can be hard to see or select a proper target in combat when there's a bunch of enemies on the screen. What's crazy about this, they already solved this issue in the first game with that special little top-down camera mode. Unfortunately, the sequel doesn't have it, although the minimap is pretty good. Speaking of maps, I like the world map in the sequel a lot more than in the first game. We still have a great visual variety, but we also have some verticality and a better map design in general. It's still a pretty linear game, although you have a bit more exploring options this time around. Elite enemies are pretty scary now, as well as the bosses. I still didn't kill all of them because of my problem with the saves, but so far I'm really enjoying the boss fights and they aged a lot better compared to the first game. The itemization system is also improved, although some of the quality of life features from the first game are stripped down. For example, you can't open all of your inventories at once like you could in the first game, which is not a huge deal, but it was pretty useful. I can't wait to play more of this game and beat it on higher difficulties. I really can't believe I never played these games before, because I can easily see them becoming one of my most favorite RPGs in general.
Why won't you believe me?
But I still have a lot of hours to put into this game, although I highly doubt my opinion will change. I highly recommend playing this game today if you like ARPGs. In 2007, we got to see a spin-off game in Dungeon Siege series that came out exclusively on PSP. Nowadays, you can easily emulate this game if you don't have the original hardware, which I did for the purposes of this video. However, I also played it on PSP around 5 years ago, when I finally got this awesome handheld console that I always wanted. I played Throne of Agony quite a bit back then, and I was pleasantly surprised how good this game actually is. It's a very simple ARPG, but it's also unique, in a way. The story picks up where Dungeon Siege 2 left off, after the second cataclysm altered the world of Arana. The new threat appears out of nowhere, again, and you get to choose between 3 heroes to try and stop it. I went with Morgrim the Warlord, and you also get to choose a pet to join your party, which is pretty useful. It took a while to get used to the very zoomed in camera, especially after playing Dungeon Siege 2. I assumed they had to do this because PSP hardware could only take so much, and for a PSP game, Throne of Agony looks decent. It's certainly not the best looking PSP game out there, even in the ARPG genre, but it's decent. More importantly, the gameplay is surprisingly pretty good as well, for what it is. Like I said, it's a simple hack and slash combat system, but it tries its best to emulate some elements from Dungeon Siege 2, for example the difficulty. Throne of Agony is nowhere near as hard as Dungeon Siege 2, but you can easily die in fights, especially if you decide to visit some higher level areas as a low level character. Speaking of which, exploring different areas of the map is done in a special gameplay mode, which resembles some strategy games I guess. It's a clever way to move the player from one location to another, without the need to actually make a full-blown open world. I mean, that would probably be impossible on PSP anyway, so yeah. The action combat is simple, but you get a decent amount of abilities to unlock when you level up, and a bunch of items to loot. You need to stack up healing potions like in every Dungeon Siege game, but it's much easier in this game. When you die in combat, you can also restart the level or go back to the city. The thing about restarting the level, it actually doesn't restart it, ironically. You only respawn at the beginning of the map, and the enemies you killed are still dead, so you just continue where you left off. One thing that's really interesting about the warrior is that you can try to press the button as fast as possible, and he hits faster when you do this for some reason. It's kinda cool actually. Overall, I like this game a lot, and I had plans to make a full video about PSP ARPGs, which are probably due in the near future. I would recommend trying it out, but only if you already played all Dungeon Siege games first. Dungeon Siege 3 was the final nail in the coffin of this legendary old-school RPG series. I covered this game before, so I'm going to play you that clip soon. However, back then, I didn't play the first two Dungeon Siege games, so I could only judge the third game for what it is and not make any comparisons. To put it simply, the third game is a very bad Dungeon Siege game, but on the other hand, it's a pretty decent ARPG, if that makes sense. It's a similar situation that Sacred 3 had, and some other games that felt the need to completely change the core gameplay design and disregard everything that made the previous games so special. Anyway, here's what I had to say about Dungeon Siege 3. Dungeon Siege 3 is an action RPG that came out in 2011. It was developed by a well-beloved RPG studio, Obsidian Entertainment. However, I'm pretty sure that Obsidian wants you to forget this game because it wasn't received with open arms. Even though the game itself was pretty decent overall, it had very little resemblance to the classic Dungeon Siege series. At least that's what the fans of this series think. I personally didn't play Dungeon Siege games. I definitely want to play them and possibly include them in one of these future videos. Dungeon Siege 3 plays like many similar games from this time period, and that's not a compliment. The gameplay is very straightforward and pretty simple to understand, with not a lot of depth, especially for an RPG. It's more like a linear action-adventure with some light RPG elements. I feel like I'm saying that a lot when it comes to games from this time period. I covered Sacred 3 in the previous video, and that game basically suffered from the same issues. You get a sequel that's pretty decent on its own, but compared to the previous entries in the series, it's a shadow of its former self. For some reason, the marketing team behind these games thought it was a good idea to streamline the game in order to make it more accessible and console-friendly, I guess. Which is fine, but when you overdo it, it's not surprising that people will react like this. Putting that aside, there is a lot to like about this game, believe it or not. Let's start with the visuals and the setting first. I absolutely love how this game looks. It has a couple of different visual themes that blend together very well. The fantasy setting is prominent throughout the entire game. Then the second part of the game introduces some steampunk elements, which was a nice and unexpected change. You're going to explore some generic woods in the beginning and do some dungeon crawling. But all of these places are pleasant to look at, and the visual variety is pretty good in general. The color palette in the first part of the game reminded me a lot of Dragon Age Origins, probably because of the brownish filter. Despite that, the color palette is very vibrant, and I always enjoyed this semi-realistic / cartoony art style. I had 0 frame drops while playing this game on my mediocre PC. You can only tell the age of this game in dialogues when you get to see these characters up close. The resolution of textures is obviously very low for today's standards, but the faces are still okay, I guess. It didn't affect my enjoyment of the story or the game in general.
What the f*** is that?
And speaking about the story, let's talk about it for a little bit. The story of Dungeon Siege 3 takes place 150 years after the events of previous games. You can choose between 4 different characters, and the story will be slightly different depending on your choice. All of these playable characters are important for the main story, so you're going to meet all of them, regardless of whom you chose. There are only slight variations in dialogue, it's not a huge deal, but it's a nice touch which gives the story a little bit more depth.
Would you judge me so quickly on account of my blood? Not every Lascansi woman is a devious witch, scheming to enchant a man's heart.
I played with Lucas because he's the only character that focuses entirely on melee combat. Lucas is a member of 10th Legion, and this faction is essential for the main story. The 10th Legion has almost been completely wiped out, and you need to rebuild that by doing various quests in the game. I like the dialogue and some characters in this game, although I found the plot a little bit confusing at times. I don't want to spoil the story here, but the story comes down to killing a mutant god at the end. The writing is decent at best. It's a little bit rough at times, and Obsidian's other games are definitely stronger on this field.
Suspicion is an ugly trait in a man, dearest. Luckily, you needn't trust me to see the profit in my offer.
You're going to have some dialogue choices here and there, which doesn't seem to affect the game in any major way, and sometimes it can be hard to tell which option will get you out of the dialogue. Which can be annoying at times, but it's not bad. I enjoyed the story for what it is, even though it kinda lost me in some parts. Oh yeah, pretty much all female characters in this game are supermodels, and I ain't complaining. So what about the gameplay? Well, I'm glad you asked.
Softly, outsider.
To circle back to my original point of discussion, the game plays like an action-adventure with some light RPG elements. A decent action-adventure which offers you some nice variety of playstyles between these 4 characters. All of these characters get 2 different weapon types, 3 active abilities for these weapons, and some special attacks. Lucas has a sword and a shield for single target damage and 2-handed sword for splash AoE damage. I try to use the 2-handed sword for most of my time with the game, but there will be situations where it's better to switch to sword and board for some quick damage. It also depends on the gear you manage to find and the stats, they are definitely important. The progression is very linear and it doesn't give you a lot of options to build your character. The majority of characters are going to end up playing the same, with some slight variations, so the replay value is not very high, unless you want to replay the game with a completely different character or in co-op modes, which I couldn't get working on my PC, unfortunately. If you play in single player mode, you will get the rest of the playable characters as followers, but you can only get one of them in the party. You can fully customize their gear and abilities as well, which is nice but not very impressive since the progression system itself is not very fun in general. And the follower AI can be very bad at times, especially in boss fights. Speaking of which, the boss fights are okay, but they highlight the biggest problems with the combat system. The melee combat with Lucas can feel very stiff, mostly because of the animation lag. Once you start casting an ability, there is no way to cancel it, which just makes the combat more clunky than it should be and unresponsive. I can count on my one hand all the RPGs and action adventures which do the animation lag properly without feeling clunky and unresponsive, and Dungeon Siege 3 is definitely not one of them. Besides that, the combat feels okay, but yeah, it's definitely more clunky than it should be. Some boss fights have downright bad design, like this one for example, that almost made me quit the whole game. Dungeon Siege 3 reuses a lot of regular elite enemies as boss fights, they only boost their health and sometimes they have an extra attack. It feels cheap and very annoying sometimes. I mean, all games do this to some extent, but it's very overdone in this game. Overall, the combat takes some time to get used to, and the camera is a little bit annoying as well. The level design is very simple and linear, and it has some very stupid moments, backtracking and no in-game map for some fucking reason. Okay, check this out, you can clearly go straight and just jump here and activate the lever or the switch or whatever and open the gate, right? But the game makes you go all the way around and activate the damn switch because, yeah, that makes sense. But the game makes this up with some great looking environments, I guess. To sum it up, I would actually recommend getting this game, but you need to know what to expect. Just like I said for Sacred 3, it's a solid action adventure overall, especially if you can get the co-op working. Even in single player mode, it's pretty fun to beat the campaign, and I think I'm going to replay it with some other characters in the future. I had a blast trying out these games for the first time, especially Dungeon Siege 1 and 2. I'm really glad I finally got to do it, and I will certainly replay both of these games in the future. I still want to finish the second game and start another playthrough right away on the harder difficulty. The second game has a very addicting gameplay loop with great RPG elements. I even had fun with the third game, although I'm pretty sure I never want to play it again. Throne of Agony was also a fun little PSP game. If you guys want to check out these games for the first time, be sure to use my GOG affiliate link and you'll support the channel. Speaking of which, huge thanks to all my channel members and Patreons. If you like these videos, consider becoming a channel supporter and you'll get some special perks. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new uploads, and I'll see you in the next one.